Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the Trails/Kiseki series, but this is going to be mainly kind of revolving around Cold Steel, but it is kind of talking about the whole franchise as a whole, and that is talking about one of the things I find so surprising about this franchise, specifically the Cold Steel games, of just how it was secretly a mech game. I mean, obviously it's not like fully a mech game, but mechs kind of play this a pretty decent chunk of the overarching story that is the Cold Steel art. And so I think it's so interesting because it's such a, obviously we're going to be talking spoilers here, so I guess I should have said that kind of up top. I'll probably include an annotation, but yeah, like the fact is that it's something that kind of comes out of nowhere, considering the way that world is designed. Is kind of this blend of mainly this kind of medieval-ish fantasy world with a science fictional spin to it, especially when it comes to like a more modernized form of warfare, because they have airships and they also have tanks. But then you have the introduction of mechs, which I think is so interesting, especially because it kind of comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, you're dealing with, like, because obviously throughout the first Cold Steel game, it's about kind of warfare, especially Erebonia's warfare, because of, I think that was, technically your first time really getting to see tanks from the Erebonia side of things. I'm sure there were some in Liberl, but obviously, like, I know there was some in the Liberl art because when Erebonia, like, crosses over and tries to, like, go into Liberl because of the whole gospel plan situation, that was your first time seeing, like, the tanks on the more, like, Erebonia side of things. But obviously when you get to the Cold Steel games, you're able to, like, fully, like, witness it. But all of that side of warfare you get to witness, like, over the course of the first Cold Steel game. And then all of a sudden at the, probably the middle point, nearing the end of chapter 7, you get thrown a loop when you're like, oh, here's a giant mech. You get introduced to Valimar, and then you also get introduced to a battle mechanic that you only get to utilize for the final 2 fights of the game. So it's such an interesting thing to kind of throw at the very, very end of a game, and I think that's so interesting. But obviously, like, Divine Knights and the whole, like, mech side of the Cold Steel games become more and more prominent as the games go on, because it becomes a part of not only, like, the overarching story, it plays a major part in the overarching story, but also it implements itself in certain battles, a few battles throughout each of the games. So like I said, it's a more prominent aspect of the game going forward with 2, 3, and 4. I think it's such an interesting thing too that the Kiseki games / Trail games have kind of done as a whole, where it's like everything's kind of built upon itself. Like, you take certain elements and you just kind of slowly build and kind of make them more of something, because you take certain elements from how it's done in Cold Steel, and then you build off on it in 2, and you build off of that more and more in 3 and 4. So I just think that's kind of interesting in its own right. But especially because, like, the mech thing becomes more and more, it became already a big enough thing in 2, but 3 and 4 it becomes even more massive, because it becomes a massive part of Erebonia's, like, military. Because obviously, especially in 4, obviously they do it in 3 because they're prepping for, the Great Twilight and Operation YourNerdGasm. Like, that was already kind of set in motion by, Osborne and stuff like that, which are just setting the stage for it. But obviously mechs become, like, a mainstay in the Erebonia's warfare, that no other country really has that. Like, Liberl doesn't have it, neither does Crossbell or Calvert. Are trying to mention even bigger places, but obviously I'd say Crossbell, even though it's a smaller place. But even, like, Rimaferia, so on and so forth. Like, obviously it's a very unique aspects allocated just to Erebonia. It's just to me so surprising. Like, you would have never, playing the first Cold Steel game, you would never, at least, hell, not even just that, even playing, like, throughout the Sky and throughout the Liberl and Crossbell games, you would have never thought you'd get to the point where mechs were such a massive part of the story, especially in that regard. But then again, I've talked about this before, Cold Steel was my first introduction to the story of the Trail/Kiseki universe. So to me, I was like, oh, that's so interesting. But then when you kind of go back to the Liberl games and the Sky games, you learn, like, oh, mechs have technically been around. I say mechs, but really robots. I delineate between mechs and robots in that I think mechs are robots that you can pilot, and if you can't pilot it, it's just a giant robot. because obviously, like I said, that whole aspect of, oh, the games kind of build upon themselves, because the first time you get introduced to like a giant mech slash robot, once again, like I said, I allocate it to just robots, is your first introduction to the archaisms, and not just like the ones that Ouroboros makes, but the ones specifically that the Liberal Bracer Squad ends up running into near the end of Trails in the Sky first chapter. Second chapter, that's also where you get introduced to Ren and Potter Martyr. To me, I wouldn't treat Potter Martyr as a mech. Maybe he is, but like I said, in my head, I delineate that because Ren doesn't actually get inside of him to pilot him. She fights alongside of him. He carries her in his hand. So it's more like a, hey, you're just a giant robot that's sentient, autonomous, just like the archaisms are. So that's why I kind of put him in his own boat. I do the same thing for the Ions in the Crossbell games, and that's kind of like another thing of, like I said, like how the games have built upon themselves, of like, okay, you get introduced to the archaisms, then you get Potter Martyr, then in the Crossbell games you get the 3 Ions, and then eventually you get the Divine Knights, which would lead to Soul Dots, and then the Zobber Soul Dots, and at the same time, because of 3, and they pop up again in 4, you get the enhanced Ions that you kind of end up having to do Divine Knight battles again. So it's in at least in 3. But either way, I think that's, like I said, such an interesting thing of like, you wouldn't have, like I said, having now going back and realize like, oh, they had the mech stuff, but it still explodes into a whole massive thing in Code Steel. So it ends up still being this surprise thing of, oh, well, with Code Steel being the first thing, it's like, oh wow, there's mechs in this universe. You go back and we're like, oh, robots have always been here, but like I said, it's on a whole other level, like especially on the more war side of things when it comes to Erebonia and its military force. So I think it's just such a surprising and interesting element that I love about that universe. And like I said, it is also very unique to Erebonia because it is something that is, I mean, because obviously, sadly, Potter Martyr is gone, so, and so are all the Ions, so and once again, even post all the Divine Knight stuff, Panzer's Soul Dots are still a major part of Erebonia's military might. I mean, especially considering there were so many that were mass-produced over the course of 3 and 4 because of Operation Yormungand. Like I said, even though Operation Yormungand didn't officially start until 4, it's still a situation of like, well, they were setting the stage for it in 3, but you know, so. Kind of also entering that territory because I made the point of that mechs are just allocated mainly now to Erebonia. It does make me wonder, will they be any mechs at all in the Calvert arc? Because obviously the little I've seen of the Calvert arc is in like a trailer. I've avoided everything as much as possible, and it seems like obviously you're going super far away from mech stuff, but once again, they threw you a curveball with the Code Steel of it. Like at the very end of Code Steel 1, it's like, bam, mechs, autonomous giant mechs that you can pilot exist in this universe. So just even more complicated because it's like, I have to even kind of like, obviously they throw that curveball to you like in the game, like at the very end, but it's like, well, in the grand scheme of things, those have existed, the Divine Knights have existed for centuries beforehand. Obviously you can learn about that in 3 and 4, but still. I just want to kind of talk about this. Like, it's just something that's kind of been, I think it's just kind of like this funny, like surprising thing about the Code Steel games, or the Trails universe in general that I love and find so fascinating. I just kind of wanted to make a video kind of talking about it a little bit. Really, that's all I wanted to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.